Welcome back, everybody. I'm so excited for our deep dive today because I think we're going to be looking at something that's very close to your heart. As a devout Catholic, we're going to be exploring the very unique way the Catholics understand worship. And, recently I was reading about this whole trend of high-profile Protestants converting to Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. It really got me thinking, what is it that is drawing them in? What do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's definitely something that a lot of people are thinking about and discussing. And I think one thing that's really at the heart of it is this concept of sacrifice. For Catholics and Orthodox Christians, the Eucharist is seen as the highest form of worship that we can offer to God.
Yeah.
Even more so than, just praising him or doing good deeds.
That's interesting. I mean, I guess it's like even in secular cultures throughout history, you see that people have this kind of intuitive understanding that offering something precious is an act of love and devotion to a deity.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the very word worship, worship kind of hints at that idea. It's about recognizing and honoring God's infinite worth.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
I mean, we praise people for their good deeds, but it's on a completely different level than the praise that we offer to God. Like praising a painter for a beautiful painting versus praising the very source of beauty itself.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. Think about Mary's Magnificat, right? He who is mighty has done great things for me. She's not simply praising God for his attributes, but for his actions, for who he is in relation to her and all of creation.
Yeah, I see that. So you mentioned Protestant worship being different. How so?
Yeah, so in Protestant worship, there's often an emphasis on giving God our utmost. So our best effort, our most heartfelt praise, our undivided attention. And while that's important, it doesn't quite reach that same level of sacrifice.
Yeah, giving our best somehow feels different from offering a true sacrifice. So this is where we get to the Eucharist, right? How does the Eucharist embody sacrifice?
Well, the Catholic Church teaches that the Mass isn't a re-sacrifice of Christ, but it's a making present of his one perfect sacrifice on Calvary,
right,
under the appearance of bread and wine.
Right, and this is absolutely central to the Catholic faith. The Catechism even calls the Eucharist the source and summit of our faith.
Right. Absolutely. It's the heart of everything we believe and do as Catholics. And there's this really beautiful concept called anamnesis, which is the memorial aspect of the Eucharist. And it connects really beautifully to how the Jewish people celebrate Passover. They're not simply remembering the Exodus intellectually, but they're making that historical event present in a real way through their rituals and actions.
Wow. I never thought about it like that. One of the sources I was reading actually mentioned this YouTuber who described many Protestant services as being centered around the sermon, almost like a TED Talk.
Right. And historically, that shift in focus is pretty visible. I mean, if you look at early churches, they were built around the altar where the Eucharist was celebrated. And pews, designed for sitting and listening, actually came about during the Reformation to accommodate longer sermons.
You're kidding. So the physical layout of the church itself changed to reflect this change in focus from the altar to the pulpit.
Exactly. And, that shift in emphasis is also reflected in the writings of many Protestant theologians who see the sermon as the central element of worship.
So if we go back even further to the early church fathers, before the Reformation, did they have a different view?
Oh, definitely. Thinkers like Cyprian, for example, strongly advocated for daily reception of the Eucharist. And Augustine, while acknowledging that there was some variation in practice, also emphasized the Eucharist's profound importance for all Christians.
So there was some variation even back then, but it seems like the frequency has definitely declined over time. Why do you think that is?
Well, during the Middle Ages, there was this growing fear of unworthiness to receive the Eucharist, which led to people receiving it less frequently. And this eventually led the Church to mandate receiving communion at least once a year. But you also have saints like Francis de Sales, who recognized the importance of frequent communion and encouraged weekly reception to fully experience the presence of Christ.
And yet, even today, some Protestant denominations only have communion monthly or even quarterly.
Yeah.
It's a pretty stark contrast to the early church's emphasis on frequent, even daily reception.
That's right. And it really raises some important questions about how different branches of Christianity view the Eucharist and its significance in the life of a believer.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It really is.
It is.
Yeah, it almost feels like in some cases the Eucharist has become like an afterthought. One of the sources I was reading even mentioned churches canceling Christmas services if they fall on a Sunday, encouraging people to just stay home instead.
It's definitely a sign of how priorities have shifted, but There is a hopeful counter movement happening too. You see modern evangelicals like Francis Chan who are rediscovering the ancient centrality of the Eucharist and really recognizing the power and significance it held for early Christians.
That is encouraging to hear. It sounds like there's a real hunger for a deeper, more authentic experience of faith. But I'm curious about something you touched on earlier. You mentioned that even some high church Protestant denominations, while having a deeper understanding of the Eucharist than some evangelicals, they still lack that concept of offering Christ's sacrifice to the Father. Can you unpack that a bit more for me? What makes that distinction so crucial?
Yeah, it's a subtle but profound difference. In Catholicism, the Mass isn't just about us receiving communion, it's also about the offering itself. We participate in the offering of Christ's sacrifice to the Father, making present that one perfect sacrifice on Calvary. And this concept of offering isn't typically found in Protestant theology.
Okay, I'm trying to wrap my head around that. So it's not just about receiving, but about actively participating in the offering. It adds a whole other dimension to the Eucharist. And this makes me think about those Protestants who are seeking a richer experience of faith. Why not just join denominations with roots in reformers like Luther or Calvin? They had a high view of the sacraments, didn't they?
They did, and some Protestants do find their way to those traditions. But for others, it's not enough. They might crave something more, like the theological stability and the deep connection to the broader historical heritage of Christendom that Catholicism and Orthodoxy offer.
So it's about that sense of historical continuity, that unbroken link to the ancient church.
Precisely. It's a powerful draw for many.
Here's something else I found really intriguing in the research. Some Protestants who convert to Catholicism actually end up leaving for more liberal denominations later on, ones where their views on issues like same-sex marriage are accepted. It seems kind of paradoxical, doesn't it? They're drawn to the ancient roots of the church, but then leave because of its teachings on certain moral issues.
It is an interesting phenomenon, and I think it speaks to the complex interplay between faith and reason and personal conviction. The Catholic Church, with its universal jurisdiction, has the authority to suppress heresy and maintain a consistent teaching across its very diverse global community. So even the most liberal parishes don't perform same-sex marriages.
So there's that consistency and stability of teaching that can be reassuring for some, even amidst diverse viewpoints within the church.
Exactly. And this contrasts with denominations that might be more susceptible to theological shifts based on cultural trends. And it's interesting, you often see that liberal Catholics tend to downplay the importance of the Eucharist, perhaps because its traditional understanding challenges their views on certain moral issues.
It's like their theological liberalism almost necessitates minimizing the Eucharist's significance.
You could say that. If the Mass is truly a making present of Christ's sacrifice, then it does challenge certain liberal viewpoints. It's a reminder that our faith isn't just about personal feelings or interpretations, but about encountering the objective truth of Christ's sacrifice and its implications for how we live our lives.
It seems everything circles back to that core understanding of worship to sacrifice. It has implications for how we understand the Eucharist, the Church's teachings, and ultimately how we live out our faith in the world.
Absolutely, and that's why grasping this concept of the Eucharist as sacrifice is so crucial for understanding what sets Catholic worship apart from other Christian traditions. It really shapes everything.
Wow, we have covered so much ground today. It's clear that this concept of sacrifice, particularly as it's embodied in the Eucharist, is absolutely fundamental to how Catholics approach worship. It's really a profound concept, and it really sets it apart from other Christian traditions.
Yeah, it really is. And what I find so fascinating is that it's not just some abstract theological idea.
Yeah.
It has real, tangible implications for how you as a Catholic experience your faith.
So what does all this mean for our listener, for someone who is living out their Catholic faith every single day?
I think the big question to ask yourself is, if the Mass is truly a making present of Christ's sacrifice, how does that change your experience of receiving communion? Does it deepen your sense of awe and reverence? Does it inspire you to live a life of greater sacrifice and love?
Those are really powerful questions to reflect on. It challenges us to go beyond just, the routine of going to Mass and really engage with those deeper aspects of our faith.
Yeah, it really is an invitation to a richer, more profound experience of the Eucharist and ultimately a deeper relationship with Christ himself.
I love that. So to our listener, we leave you with that thought-provoking question. Let it resonate in your heart. Let it shape how you approach the source and summit of our faith. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the heart of Catholic worship.